Welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference. Leading our discussion today is Ted Broman, Senior Research Fellow in Anglo-American Relations in our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He, of course, looks at the Anglo-American relationship, U.S. and British relations with Europe and the European Union, the U.S. leadership role in the world, as well as international organizations and treaties. Before joining us here at Heritage, he served as Yale's Associate Director of International Security Studies. He was also a lecturer in history and international affairs for Yale's Master of Arts program. He is now also an adjunct professor of strategic studies in the Strategic Studies program at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Please join me in welcoming Ted Broman. Ted?
Great. Thanks very much, John. Normally, when we hold events in February, I have to thank all the people who attend for making it in spite of the atrocious weather, the snow, and the sleet, and the ice. Today, I want to thank everyone for attending in spite of the fact that it's about 65 degrees out there, and it feels like spring. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation. As my boss, James Carafano, says, sometimes it's important for us at think tanks, centers on public policy options, to step away from immediate policy concerns for a little while and turn to longer, more historically informed questions and discussions. And that's something that we'd like to do today. When you look at the kind of things that we're worried about here at Heritage, certainly in the foreign policy realm, a lot of them tend to revolve around questions relating to Russia's foreign policy, Russia's domestic economy, China's foreign policy, China's domestic economy. And I don't think it's terribly controversial to say that the common perception out there today is that China is a very strong and rising nation, and Russia, although perhaps tactically fairly strong, is in the long run in a relatively weaker position than China. Now, short advertisement, we're having an event next week with Dr. Michael Oslin of AEI next Tuesday at 11 o'clock, speaking on his book on Asia, which will question a little bit the idea that China is as strong as we believe it is, but certainly that's the common perception. So how did we get to this point? Well, in the early 1990s, there was sort of a common perception out there, and I just was digging around in my own personal archives and found a paper from 1992. This is by a very distinguished scholar, Jack Goldstone, giving his take on China and Russia. I just want to read this to you as a sense of the way some very informed and senior academics were thinking about this question in the early 90s. Quoting Professor Goldstone, "If there is a lesson to be gained from the comparative experience of the USSR, Hungary, and the post-Soviet states, it is that communist leaders gained more stable regime transitions when they choose to seek democratic support before economic conditions deteriorated so far that the communist leadership cannot escape blame. It seems that the path China is determined to follow, largely abandoning communist management of the economy while maintaining tight Communist Party control of society, is destabilizing." So in the early 1990s, and one has to remember the importance of Tiananmen Square, above all, in this sort of scholarship, a fairly common perception was that the Soviet Union, Russia, was on the right path, the path to reform, and China was on the wrong path, the path of repression, instability, and Tiananmen Square. Well, things have turned out rather differently. Now, it turns out that it wasn't just Professor Goldstone and lots of other people in the early 1990s who were interested in this comparison between the USSR and China. Turns out Mikhail Gorbachev was also very interested in this comparison. And it's that comparison and the effort to learn lessons from it that's at the center of our event today. It's my pleasure to welcome to Heritage Dr. Chris Miller, who is the Associate Director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grant Strategy at Yale University, a program that I know extremely well, having been involved in its foundation back in 1999-2000. Dr. Miller previously served as lecturer at the New Economics School in Moscow, as a visiting researcher at the Carnegie Moscow Center, and as a research associate at the Brookings Institution, though we won't hold that against him. He's held fellowships from the German Marshall Fund and the Hoover Institution. He received his PhD and his MA from Yale and his BA in history from Harvard University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Miller to speak at Heritage on his first book, The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Mikhail Gorbachev and the Collapse of the USSR, published in 2016 by UNC Press. Dr. Miller.
Well, thank you very much, Ted. It's an exciting time to talk about Russian history, not only because, as you're all aware, Russia's in the news a lot today for good reasons and for bad reasons, but also because this is a time of anniversaries for Russia. Just this past December was the 25th anniversary of the Soviet Union's collapse, and this entire year marks the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, when the communists first took power in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. So it's in some ways a very timely period to look back at the sources of Russian history that led to the current government taking power today. So I'd like to turn back to the period 25 years ago, a quarter century ago, when the Soviet Union was beginning to fall apart, and ask what went wrong and why. And to do so, I'd like to compare that period of history with China. Now, the period of the end of the Cold War, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the establishment of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, you might not think of Beijing as a central city in this history. But in fact, in May 1989, and you have photos up here of protesters amassing in Tiananmen Square, the protesters in Tiananmen were looking not to Central Europeans asking for democracy, not towards human rights advocates in the West, but actually to Mikhail Gorbachev as a prophet of democracy, as they saw him. And this is written in Chinese and in Russian, democracy, our common dream. And the Chinese protesters were assembled on Tiananmen in May 1989, in part because Gorbachev was coming to visit Beijing, the first visit by a Soviet leader to China from... Close the microphone, yeah. The first time the Soviet leader had visited China since the time of Khrushchev. So this was a period of new relations between the two countries' governments. But of course, after 1989, the two countries diverged very sharply. And here we have a chart of Chinese and Russian GDP, rebased at 100 in 1989. And as you can see, and this is no surprise to anyone, China has done very, very well, and the Soviet Union and its successor states have done rather poorly. But if you go back to 1985, which is the year that Mikhail Gorbachev first took power, what becomes clear is that although the Soviet Union is in stagnation, and here's two measures of Soviet GDP growth declining from the entire post-war period to 1985, it was not in a state of crisis in 1985. And so here we have a chart of the budget deficit, which was basically at zero when Gorbachev took power, and then suddenly, in the years of perestroika, the budget catastrophically collapsed. And so the question I'd like to ask today is, what was it about perestroika that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union's budget, led tax revenues to decline, spending to increase, and the entire country to hurtle towards economic disaster? Why did that happen? Now, there are two basic schools of thought in explaining the Soviet Union's collapse, one on the left end of the political spectrum, the other on the right end, and both the arguments make reference to China. So on the left of the political spectrum, the argument is that the Soviet Union should have followed China's more gradual economic transition. So here the idea is that capitalism created too much corruption, or it didn't create increases in output, and if only Gorbachev had followed the Chinese economic path, he would have had better results. Meanwhile, on the right end of the political spectrum, and especially on the authoritarian right that we see prominent in Russia today, the argument is very different, but again made with reference to China. Here the argument is that if only Gorbachev had abandoned democracy and kept authoritarian rule, as the Soviet Union had long had, he could have pushed through tough economic reforms against resistance that would have led to better economic outcomes. So both on the left and the right, you have very different arguments, but both of them assume that the Soviet Union could have learned something from China, but failed to do so. And I was struck when I first began my research in Soviet archives, and I spent 2 years in Moscow digging through papers from the period to find dozens upon dozens of references from Gorbachev and his top advisors as they studied the Chinese example. They tried to figure out what were the Chinese doing in the 1980s to make their economy grow, how were the Chinese transitioning from a socialist economy to a market economy, and what lessons could they learn from China's experience. So first, maybe rolling back as to why would the Soviets be looking at the Chinese as a model of economic growth to begin with? You might, for example, expect that as the Soviets transitioned towards market socialism, they would look at the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, places like Hungary or Yugoslavia, which had a sort of mixed economy throughout most of the Cold War period. But by the 1980s, when perestroika was being formulated, these countries were in the midst of deep recessions. Here we have a chart of GDP growth in several Central European countries, and you can see that none of them looked like appealing examples of market socialism in the years that perestroika was being designed. At the same time, too, to many Soviet officials, but also to many in the West, America seemed like a less appealing model of capitalism. The 1970s were the era of stagflation, and in the early 1980s, as the Fed hiked interest rates and unemployment shot higher, many in the West were also questioning whether capitalism indeed had a future. And the 1980s in the United States, but across the world, were the period of Japan as number one, as Ezra Vogel's famous book had it. Many Americans believed that Japan had found a new model of combining democracy and capitalism that provided higher growth rates with less social division. There were fewer strikes in Japan, there was less political tension, and many people believed that this was a new model of capitalism. And indeed, it wasn't only in the US where people were looking at Japan as a model for the future. I was surprised, although I shouldn't have been, to find dozens of footnotes in Soviet sources citing Ezra Vogel's book, Japan as number one, as they too were looking to Japan and saying, wow, something new is going on here. But of course, if you were the Soviet Union looking towards East Asia, looking for Asian models of capitalism, as they were described at the time, the natural place to turn was not to Japan or to South Korea or to any of the Asian tigers, but to the socialist country in East Asia, China. And it turns out that dozens upon dozens of leading Soviet economists, officials, political advisors visited China throughout the 1980s. They visited Shanghai and Shenzhen to try to learn about Chinese industrial reforms. They visited the countryside to learn about agriculture. And after all their visits, they wrote memos to the top Soviet leaders, including Gorbachev himself, saying, this is how China is transitioning to capitalism. These are the lessons the Soviet Union could learn. So across the Soviet political system, by the mid to late 1980s, everyone was aware of what China was doing, and everyone was thinking about what lessons might be drawn from that experience for the Soviet Union. So I hope I've convinced you that the ideas about what was going on in China during the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping's period of reform and opening, was in the Soviet political system. But the next question is, how do these new ideas interact with the political structures that dominated Soviet politics? And here, too, my research was very much shaped by the archives that I was able to visit. There are three types of archival sources, just to give you a sense of where this data is coming from. The first are papers from Soviet research institutes, sort of the think tanks of the Soviet Union. The second source are papers from government bodies like the State Bank or the Finance Ministry, and these were the institutions that were actually implementing reforms. And finally, third, and this is most important, records from the Soviet Politburo, which is the top policymaking body of the Communist Party, which made all of the important decisions in the Soviet Union. We have from the period from 1985 to 1991, a very unique view into the Politburo papers, because for most of the post-war period, the Politburo papers are closed. But when Gorbachev was in power from 85 to 91, three of his aides took regular notes at Politburo meetings. And they deposited those notes in a different archive than the normal Politburo papers. And so we have this unique glimpse into the top levels of Soviet politics, unlike any other period during the post-Cold War era, or during the Cold War era. And when you start looking through these sources, as I did over the course of 2 years, you immediately discover that not only was the Communist Party itself powerful, naturally enough, since it was running the government, but there were also interest groups that played an enormous role in Soviet politics. And there were three interest groups that stand out above all. The first of those was the military-industrial complex. The second was the fuel-energy complex, which is the network of gas and oil companies that made up Russia's biggest export industry. And third is the agro-industrial complex. And these are words that I didn't invent these words. These are Russian words translated into English. These are words that the Soviets at the time used to describe these groups that played such an immense role in Soviet politics. And what I found was that as the Soviet Union debated the reforms that they saw China implementing, these three interest groups played an inordinate role in shaping the outcomes of reforms. And when Gorbachev wanted to push towards a more market-oriented political system, he had to compromise with these groups, which felt that they were threatened by the changes. So I'd like to give you two case studies of Gorbachev introducing new reformist ideas into Soviet politics, and these interest groups pushing back and demanding that they get some benefits in exchange. The first case study is in industrial reforms. I call this Soviet industry Sichuan style because it was Sichuan province in China which first experimented with industrial reforms on a large scale. So Soviet economists visited China repeatedly throughout the 1980s, studying what China was doing to make its industries more efficient, to introduce market mechanisms in its planned economy. And they realized that China had provided a new set of incentives for state-owned firms, and they'd replaced a policy of profit confiscation, whereby firms had to turn over all their profits to the state, with one of taxation. So firms suddenly had an incentive to make profit. And Soviet officials liked what they saw in China. They believed that China's new incentives were encouraging enterprises to be more efficient, to produce more effectively, and to make money. But when these ideas were introduced into the Politburo, they faced an immediate pushback. And the pushback happened on two different levels. The first level was ideological, the idea that these new ideas threatened socialism, which was the basis of the Soviet political system. And the second type of pushback was interest group based, the idea that these ideas threatened interest groups which were immensely powerful in the Soviet political system. So for example, when Gorbachev introduced the idea of introducing more incentives to make Soviet enterprises run more efficiently, Andrei Gromyko, who I have a picture of right here, he was the longtime Soviet foreign minister, immediately pushed back on that. And again, he pushed back in two different ways. First, he said, this questions the basic foundation of our socialist regime. This is capitalism, not socialism. Therefore, it's not a good thing in a socialist country. But the second type of pushback, which Gromyko levied, was that actually it's tough for military factories, he wrote. Our industries are lame in both legs. There's no movement. Equipment is extremely old. So A, these ideas threaten our ideology. B, by the way, can you please spend some more money on factories that are politically associated with me? And it was always this 1-2 punch of critiques. A, this threatens socialism. B, please spend more money on my favorite industries. That always was the response to Gorbachev's reform initiatives. Now, Gorbachev and his advisors were not impressed by these critiques, but they had no choice but to deal with them. The interest groups were just too powerful. They had to find a way to compromise. And by the end of the Soviet Union, by 1991, they had found a compromise. And on paper, the Soviet Union implemented reforms that looked very similar to what China had implemented just several years earlier. So for example, by 1986, it was now legal to work outside of a state-owned business in the Soviet Union. The law on state enterprises of 1987 strengthened incentives for enterprises to work effectively. And by 1988, the law on cooperatives had basically legalized private businesses. So these were huge steps towards capitalism, more or less copying what China had done. But there was one big difference between what the Soviet Union did and the compromises that Gorbachev had to cut with his own interest groups. And that was that Gorbachev had to promise a huge wave of new capital investment, almost all of which was wasted. But that was the quid pro quo to buy off support from the industrial interest groups. So I have a chart here of a number of industrial production measures. You can see that they shoot up after 1985 as Gorbachev surges money into the industrial sector. This is what industries are demanding in exchange for support. But none of this investment is useful. It's all wasted because Soviet industries are no more efficient in 1987 as they were in 1985. And so this huge surge of investment is entirely wasted, but it stresses the budget immensely. So there's a huge cost to this program, but no economic benefit from it. Second case study, agriculture. Like in industry, the Soviet Union was very interested in learning about China's agricultural reforms. So China had these large collective farms like the Soviet Union where hundreds of farmers worked on the same farm. And this was an incredibly inefficient system because individual farmers lacked any incentive to produce a lot of grain because you were paid not based on how much grain you produced, but just based on the fact that you were a member of the collective farm. And the Soviet Union watched as China moved from a system of collective farming to individual farming, whereby individual households were given control over their own production. And as you can easily imagine, this improved households' incentives and led to higher output on farms. And so the Soviet Union looked at this and said, this looks very sensible. We can implement these types of measures on our own collective farms. But as an industry, this type of idea faced a two-part pushback. One was ideological. Second was interest group-based. So here's the ideological critique. This is Igor Ligachov, who is the number 2 person in the Communist Party hierarchy, so the person directly below Gorbachev, an enormously influential figure. He argued in 1989 that the Czechs, that is Moscow's socialist allies, are very worried by our publications on agrarian questions. They say it is the capitalist road, i.e. this is threatening the victory of socialism in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev says bullshit. But at the same time, Ligachev immediately follows that up by saying, by the way, our capital investment in agriculture was very effective, and in fact, we need more of it. We need more spending in agriculture. Now, it turned out that the Soviet Union in the early 1980s, even before perestroika began, had, by one estimate, the largest farm subsidy program in human history. Its farms were immensely inefficient. They owned far too many tractors. They spent far too much on fertilizer and had far less farm output, either per acre or per worker, than comparable farms in Western Europe or in the United States. So the problem wasn't a deficit of investment. It was that investment was used very, very poorly. But from the perspective of the farm lobby, investment was a great thing because it made them better off. Now, as in the industrial sector, Gorbachev cut a deal. And so by 1991, he was able to push through reforms that on paper looked very similar to China. So for example, by 1991, individual farmers could at least on paper lease land. So they could de facto own their own land. Payment was based on output, so the more grain you produced, the more payment you got. And farmland was essentially decollectivized, so the massive collective farms were broken slowly into pieces. And all this was very similar to China. But like in the industrial reforms, Gorbachev had to agree to a quid pro quo. In exchange for the legal changes, he had to promise more spending on farms. So here we have a chart of farm subsidies in billions of rubles, and as you can see, by any measure, they increase steadily throughout the 1980s. And they reached the point where by 1989, the increase on farm subsidies from 1982 constituted something around half of the size of the total budget deficit of the Soviet Union. So this was an enormous farm subsidy program. And when you think back to the chart of the budget deficit that I showed at the beginning of the talk, half of that in 1989 was explained by increases in farm subsidies. So the magnitude is just truly enormous. So stepping back to the comparison with China, what went wrong? On the one hand, I hope I've showed you that agricultural reforms were on paper pretty similar to what China did, that industrial reforms as well on paper looked fairly similar as well, that they were copied off China, mirrored on China's experience. But the big difference was the budget deficit, that China didn't have to do these deals with its interest groups, so it didn't have to develop this massive budget deficit, where Gorbachev had no choice. If he wanted to push reforms through, he had to cut deals with the interest groups. If he wanted to cut these deals, he had to spend money to do it. And so that's how you get, and this is the same graph I showed at the beginning, this massive budget deficit reaching a third of GDP by 1991. That is truly an enormous figure. Makes Greece look like a very well-managed country. It's in some ways historically perhaps unprecedented. It's hard to find other examples of data where there are countries with such a large budget deficit. Now, there's a common theory that one of the major causes of the Soviet budget deficit in the 1980s was the decline in international oil prices. And certainly it's true that the Soviet Union was a large oil exporter. Certainly it's true that the oil price fell beginning in 1984. And this did indeed hurt the Soviet Union and decrease its export revenue. But it's also important to recognize that the decline in oil export revenue explains only a portion, less than half, of the increase in the budget deficit. So certainly oil stressed the budgetary situation, but so too did farm subsidies. And there's no evidence that the oil shock was any worse than the farm subsidy shock, which was entirely self-inflicted. So I think it's important not to blame it all on outside factors like oil prices, when in fact there were many domestic causes that were no less important, if not more important. Now, any government that has a budget deficit faces three basic options. One, you can cut spending. Two, you can increase taxes. And three, you can issue debt. Gorbachev felt, and accurately in my view, he believed this, that the first two options were not available to him, because if he tried to cut spending or raise taxes on either the industrial lobby or the farm sector, they would throw him out of office. And if he tried to increase taxes or cut spending on civilians, on households, there would be a huge surge of popular unrest that would empower the more Stalinist factions and again lead to him being removed from office. So he faced a very tough political balance. He couldn't raise taxes, he couldn't cut spending. And so the only option, if you wanted to run these deficits that were necessary for these political deals, was to issue debt. In the early years of perestroika, it was possible to borrow from abroad. So American, German, other lenders were willing to issue debt to the Soviet Union. But by 1989, international debt markets were basically closed because the Soviet Union was seen as too risky a borrower. And so the only option left for Gorbachev was to print money. And print money the Soviet Union did in a truly massive scale. This is a chart of the amount of the deficit that was funded by money creation. As you can see, there's basically no deficit-financed money creation until 1989, and then suddenly it shoots upwards. And this is Gorbachev paying the cost of the deals that he's cutting with the farm lobby and the various industrial groups. So this is a surge of money throughout the Soviet economy. Now, in a capitalist economy, when the money supply increases very rapidly, so too do prices. But in a planned socialist economy, prices are set by the government, so prices can't increase, at least in legal markets. But the incentive you face when the money supply is increasing very rapidly and prices are controlled are to sell your goods in non-legal markets. And so beginning in the late 1980s and especially in the early 1990s, production rushed to black markets as everyone realized that it made no sense to sell in state markets when you could only get 2 rubles for your loaf of bread, but you could get 10 or 20 or 200 rubles on the black market. And so as producers of all sorts of goods rushed to the black market, the government's tax take collapsed because the black market wasn't taxed, even though the white market was collapsed. And its ability to gather resources that it required for spending just disappeared. And so by 1991, when you get to the famous military coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, when the military locked him in his Crimean dacha for 3 days, it wasn't actually Gorbachev that was able to defeat the coup. It was Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, because Gorbachev was already so weak that his governmental power had already dissipated to such a great extent that he had no more control over the levers of power, that he was practically impotent. And so he was reinstalled briefly as president of the Soviet Union, but several months later, Boris Yeltsin, meeting with the presidents of Belarus and Ukraine, decided to abolish the country that Gorbachev governed, and Gorbachev had no tools with which to resist. So in December 1991, the Soviet Union was no more. Now, going back to my initial question and the comparison with China, why did this happen? There's a view that's very common in Russia and China, but also I think to a not insignificant extent in the United States, which I call the Beijing consensus about what went wrong in the Soviet Union. I have a couple of quotes from Chinese leaders here. This is Jiang Zemin, who argued that the problem in the Soviet Union was that Gorbachev was a traitor like Trotsky. That's ironic, given that Jiang Zemin was the first person to formally welcome business classes into the Chinese Communist Party. Deng Xiaoping's son famously said, "My father thinks Gorbachev is an idiot." That's a very popular interpretation in Russia today. And finally, most interestingly right now is Xi Jinping, who's argued, why did the Soviet Union disintegrate? Nobody was a real man. Nobody came out to resist. And so he's thinking, of course, of Tiananmen, where the Chinese party was willing to resist, and Gorbachev, he argues, was not willing to resist. And of course, if you go to Beijing these days, as many of you I'm sure are aware, there's increasing talk about how Xi Jinping is looking towards Russia as a model, and specifically Putin as a model for how he wants to evolve the Chinese political system today. So the strongman authoritarian idea remains alive and well in Beijing. But what I hope I suggested to you via this history is that, in fact, the comparison between China and Russia, or the Soviet Union, misplays the vast differences in their domestic politics. So in the Soviet Union, interest groups were strong and Gorbachev was weak. In the Soviet Union, political elites saw economic reform as a threat rather than an opportunity. And most importantly, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union was strongly opposed to reform rather than a proponent of it. And all of these things were different in China, where Deng Xiaoping and the Communist Party were enormously powerful and almost everyone supported reform efforts to varying degrees. So the domestic politics were the exact opposite. And one of the ironies is that one reason that Gorbachev tried to embrace democracy, which is the critique that he's given from the authoritarian right today, is that that was his only hope of outmaneuvering the Communist Party and the interest groups that dominated it to push through his economic reforms. So he couldn't use the party apparatus to reform. He had to find another source of legitimacy, and he hoped that legitimacy would be possible to find in the Soviet people. So democratization was not only a political strategy, it was also an economic strategy to find a way around the interest groups that dominated the party. Now, this is, of course, the graph that colors our perception of the Cold War's end, China shooting upwards and the Soviet Union collapsing. What I hope I've showed to you today is that this isn't simply evidence of Chinese wisdom in reforming more slowly or in keeping an authoritarian grip on power. It's evidence of the failure of Soviet domestic politics to bring a reform coalition to power that could have actually found a way from communism to capitalism without political collapse. So with that, I'd be happy to wrap up and take any questions that you have.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. I have to say, I've never heard of a country with an enormous budget deficit financing things by creating money on a large scale. I mean, certainly we would never do such a foolish thing in the United States. So with that small comparison, I'm going to take the usual moderator's privilege of asking the first question. We haven't seen a lot of these columns recently, but for a while, Tom Friedman had almost a regular series he was running in praise of Chinese authoritarianism. You know, Chinese government is strong government is good government can build high-speed railways and you know, tall buildings and canals and whatever else Tom Friedman thought was a good idea. Well, I've never said this sentence before in my life, but apparently Tom Friedman was right. Right? I mean, strong authoritarian Chinese government is the answer. Would you sort of care to sort of take on the Friedmanite interpretation of, you know, contemporary China in light of his, you know, newspaper columns?
For sure, I'd be happy to. In many ways, actually, China today faces a situation very similar to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So the countries were very different in the 80s, but if you look at the Soviet Union then and China now, there are some striking similarities. I'm not saying that China is going to face an economic collapse right away, but if you look at the political structure, in fact, things are a lot more similar than I think Xi Jinping might like to admit. And the most important factor that's similar, I think, is the immense role that interest groups play in economic policy making in China. So for example, almost everyone in Chinese policymaking circles agrees that the government invests too much in ways that are economically inefficient. And they've been saying this since the mid-2000s, that there's too much investment, not enough household consumption, that China needs to rebalance its economy towards household consumption so that it's not wasting money on unneeded investment. If you listen to Xi Jinping's speeches, he makes a speech about this on a regular basis. China's going to have a consumption-based economy, household incomes will increase, we will have a service sector that's growing, et cetera, et cetera. If you actually look at Chinese economic data, you don't see much evidence of that at all. That in fact, there's no shift that's particularly visible towards Chinese households, that investment levels haven't declined, they've actually increased in recent years. And the reason for that is because whatever Xi Jinping says, the economic policymaking process in the Chinese Communist Party is dominated by interest groups, which have a great interest in keeping investment levels extraordinarily high. So I think there's some concern that certainly when you talk to Chinese who are close to the government, there's concern that Chinese state-owned enterprises are having an inordinate effect on policymaking, that they're leading towards huge wastes of money as investment is increasing rather than decreasing as it ought to. And so there is, I think, some concern that although on paper Chinese leaders look like they have immense power, in reality Xi Jinping is very powerful in comparison to a Chinese citizen, but not always that powerful in comparison to a Chinese party elite. And it's in fact the party elites that he's trying to wrangle right now, and judging by the evidence of the past several years, he's failed to do that in a way that would actually lead China to a more sustainable economic path. So it seems to me that there are some real lessons that China ought to learn from the 1980s Soviet Union, and they're not lessons about authoritarianism, they're lessons about making sure you have the right interests represented in your party, and making sure that you have checks on the power of interest groups within your political structure.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Let's take some questions from the audience. As always, if you have an affiliation, if you can please state your affiliation. If you don't, that's just fine. You can also state your name. And as always, if you can please phrase your question in the form of a question. Let's take the gentleman sitting right there on the aisle. Do we have microphones? We do not apparently have microphones.
I'll be very loud.
Yes, and Dr. Miller, maybe you could repeat the question for the benefit of future viewers when he's done asking it.
James Sag, retired. Since we're doing history, one doesn't want to be anachronistic. So we know China's been a great success, and Soviet Union, as you've shown, has not done well. But in 1990, the period from 1980 to 1990, China had done well. But you could have waved your hands and said, well, they did so awful between 1960 and 1980. So from the Russian point of view, did they really expect that the Chinese reforms would produce great things? Or could they have said, I can imagine a Russian bureaucrat saying, well, they're doing different things, but they're not going to go anywhere, so we should. So what were their expectations for China?
Sure, so the question is about Soviet expectations of Chinese economic growth after the 1980s. You can actually go back into the Soviet archives and look at the economic forecasting institutes that the Soviets had, which were developing forecasts for Chinese growth into the 1990s and 2000s. And what you find is actually that Soviet forecasts were fairly optimistic about Chinese growth. They didn't expect a repeat of the Cultural Revolution. They didn't expect a repeat of the Great Leap Forward. They believed that Deng Xiaoping had really kind of fundamentally changed Chinese political economy in a way that set China on a much more stable growth path forward. So they were optimistic about China, which is one of the reasons that they thought it was an interesting model to learn from.
A gentleman seated in the back there.
My name's Jeff. I just recently graduated from the London School of Economics and Master's in History, did a lot of Soviet history. And one thing, I took a class on the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. On the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. And one thing we debated about in the Gorbachev class was that the end of the Cold War affected Soviet economic reform. So in your opinion, did the end of the antagonistic relationship with the United States and Soviet withdrawal from conflicts such as Afghanistan and supporting countries like Angola and Ethiopia and Vietnam affect the Soviet military-industrial complex, which affected the ability of Gorbachev to implement reforms?
The answer is not that much. There's actually a great anecdote when Gorbachev was meeting with President George H.W. Bush in Malta. This is right after the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Cold War was ending, everyone was withdrawing forces from Central Europe. And Bush says to Gorbachev, listen, we're cutting military spending at home. Why don't you try to do the same thing? It'll be good for your economy. And Gorbachev says to Bush, you know, listen, we need to reduce arms in a way that won't make the army rise up. He was worried about a military coup because military spending cuts, he feared correctly, as it turned out, might lead to a coup. And so the reality was that as much as Gorbachev might have wanted to cut military spending, The reality was that it was politically infeasible until the coup actually finally delegitimized the Soviet military. But basically, there's not much evidence of any decrease in military spending as a share of the total budget or as a share of GDP until 1991. So certainly the Soviets were withdrawing from places in Africa and elsewhere where they were fighting proxy wars in the United States, but these were marginal costs compared to the total size of the Soviet military budget. And that just attests again to the immense power that the Soviet military-industrial complex wielded over Soviet politics.
I think I saw another hand earlier from, yes, there.
Bill Miller, I'm a retired U.S. Navy. I was impressed by the quote from Gorbachev, and I wonder if that's an exact translation for BS, and if you happen to know the Russian for that word that he used.
You know, I translated it several years ago, so I forget now what is the Russian word that he used. But yeah, that's a fairly exact translation, yeah.
With emphasis. Good response.
They didn't always use the cleanest language in Politburo meetings.
I'll take moderator's privilege and ask another question. In the 1970s, one of the common diagnoses of, to an extent, American politics, but certainly British politics, was that democratic systems were riddled by interest groups to the point where any sort of meaningful economic or political change turned out to be impossible. That diagnosis fell on harder times in the 1980s in the UK with Margaret Thatcher and the US with Reagan. It turned out that actually systems were more malleable and interest groups were less significant than theorists in the 70s had argued that they were. Is there any sort of comparable Soviet discussion before Gorbachev comes along of, you know, we're building up enormous interest groups in this country, or we've built up enormous interest groups in this country, and it's locking the system into a kind of a stasis? And there's a lot of historical/political science literature even now on this question as it relates to the West, a lot of which I think is of rather high quality. Did the Soviets conceive of this as a problem before they got to the cliff of 87, 88, 89, or did it just not come up?
That's a really important question because it cuts to the core of Soviet politics during this period. If you think of the mindset of Soviet leaders in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, all of them had lived through, or their parents had lived through, Stalinism, which was a period when Soviet officials were rotated rapidly, sent to the gulags on a regular basis, shot in large numbers. And that was Stalin's way of rotating various elites around the country and making sure that interest groups, patronage networks simply didn't form. So under Stalin, actually, if you were a factory manager, you had a very strong incentive to make sure your factory produced efficiently because the cost was extraordinarily high if you displeased the leader. Now, when Khrushchev and then Brezhnev came to power in the 50s and 60s, they actively tried to move away from Stalin-style methods, in part because there was so much reversion in the party elite to having such brutal methods used on the elite itself. And so Khrushchev was one of the first people to move away from a large-scale use of violence on the political elite. And then Brezhnev had a policy called the stability of the cadres, which promised basically that there wouldn't be a lot of rotation, either among the economic elite or among the political elite. So it was actually an active attempt to have less rotation as a response to the chaos of the Stalin period. Now, the effect of that is, as Ted rightly pointed out, was sclerosis and stagnation, that as you had fewer people moving between different groups and you had no incentives to act efficiently, indeed efficiency declined very rapidly. And this is an interesting comparison with China, too. It's probably not a coincidence that Deng Xiaoping was able to enact these immense reforms in China right after the Cultural Revolution, which was an immense shock on the Communist Party. And so whatever interest groups did exist beforehand were torn apart by the violence of the revolution in China. And so there was kind of a uncomfortable silver lining of sorts to the Cultural Revolution in China, which is that it destroyed the party's infrastructure in the extent that made it possible for a leader like Deng to push through very large-scale reforms, which probably would have been impossible had the Cultural Revolution not taken place. But in the Soviet context, everyone had lived through Stalinism and didn't want to see that repeated. So there was a lot of resistance to any sort of method that would have any sort of rotation, even by nonviolent methods being used in the Soviet elite.
Several questions here. The gentleman at the very back, if you can wait for the microphone to get to you. Great, thank you.
My name is Javier Martinez, Heritage Foundation. I just wanted to know what effect, if any, did the end of mass arrests under Article 58 have to do, with regards to slave labor use, how much effect did that have on the economic stagnation that took place in the Soviet Union?
I think the answer is probably not that much effect. One of the things that you had with the labor camps was that certainly they were not only political tools, they were also economic tools. But I wouldn't say that there's a direct tie between the decline of the labor camps and the perestroika reforms that you see later on. So I wouldn't kind of draw a one-to-one comparison between those two different trends.
And there's a gentleman, yes, right there, if you could wait for the microphone for just a second.
I'm Steve Sunderland with USAID. I'm wondering, looking forward after the Gorbachev years, if you might comment on how these interest group politics affected the privatization process in Russia.
That's a really good question. When the Soviet Union collapsed in late 1991, early 1992, it had different effects on the different interest groups. So because the military had led the coup against Gorbachev, it was largely discredited, and it was also very heavily damaged by the fact that the country split into 15 separate countries. And so you had military spending fall very, very sharply in 1992, 93, 94, because it was politically possible to reduce the amount that was spent in the military under the early Yeltsin years when Boris Yeltsin was president. The agricultural sector, too, faced very, very sharp cuts during the period because they lost their representation in Moscow. So the patronage networks that had sustained them for the entire Soviet period were destroyed when the Communist Party collapsed. And so they, too, faced subsidy cuts and declines in agricultural income for much of the early 1990s. The industries, however, remained very influential, not only in Russia, but also in many of the other post-Soviet countries. And so when you got to the point when privatization was being discussed in 1992, 93, 94, the industries basically dominated the Duma. And so the Duma only allowed a privatization law to pass if it gave significant benefits to the managers of those industries. So the Soviet-era managers, who were largely still in place in 1992, 1993, forced the Duma, against Yeltsin's wishes, to pass a law that gave a big ownership stake to them for free. And in some ways, actually, privatization, when you step back, looks a lot less like a significant change in Russia, in part because even before privatization happened in legal terms, it had already happened in de facto terms, which is to say that the Soviet managers, after 1991, seized control of their businesses, took the profits for themselves, and ran them as if they were their own personal property. And so what we, as outsiders, looked at as privatization was, in reality, just the legalization of what had already occurred by force, using mafia groups, and using connections that had been forged in the Soviet period. So I think a lot of the literature that focuses on privatization as a key theme of the 1990s actually misses the fact that privatization really happened right when the Soviet Union was collapsing, and the legal changes was just a recognition that actually control had already shifted.
I have to say the discussion of interest groups and the way they ebb and flow reminds me of one of my favorite books of all time, which is Mansur Olson's The Rise and Decline of Nations. And if anyone in the audience has not read this work, I encourage you to read it. It's like mid-1970s, late 1970s.
That's right.
78 or 79, I think. And Olson argues, and I'm probably doing some violence to the thesis, that interest groups build up in societies and polities, especially ones that don't lose wars. And that the best thing in the long run is to lose a war occasionally so you have a chance to sort of flush the system out. And the Cultural Revolution is maybe a war on the Chinese people. It's not sort of a conventional sort of war, but it's a kind of a war. And the end of the Soviet Union, from this perspective, feels like sort of a partial war, although not a complete one. Olson wasn't writing about communist China or the Soviet Union. He was writing mostly about Western societies. But it's, I think, a remarkably insightful book, and I think confirmed to a certain extent by the research you've done.
And one of the things that I think you realize in looking at the comparison between the Soviet Union and the Western economies that you mentioned, Ted, was that actually it turns out that when we look historically from 1945 to the present, for example, that democracy actually in the long run has proved a reasonably effective means of shifting elites in a way that leads to interest groups not forming in a too detrimental way. Certainly we have interest groups, but nowhere near on the scale as they had in the Soviet Union. And so I think a question for us looking at this history is what are the institutions that we need to make sure that we don't have interest groups get even stronger than they are, because certainly in the long run, as interest groups that benefit from inefficiency gain power, that's bad for everyone. That's an interesting kind of question institutionally for us to think about in our own context. looking at the Soviet collapse.
Gentleman right in the very front here has a question. If you could wait for the microphone for just a second, it's coming around.
I do okay.
We have a second microphone, just in case the first one doesn't work. So
Okay.
here we go.
Chris Mandarin, okay. Vladimir Tikarov, I'm CFO of Epion Bio. And as you can figure out by the name, I kind of know a lot of that stuff. I'm originally from Bulgaria. My undergraduate degree is in central planning, and I was there during those times. So a couple of things. Unfortunately, I missed the beginning of your lecture. But I think basically going with the Chinese comparison, first of all, it's presentism. We didn't know China is going to be so successful then. And second, it misses the fundamental differences between China and Russia on the economic basis. Oops. I know. China is a homogeneous.
Russians are calling.
China is a homogeneous nation. The Russians are multi-ethnic federalist structure. China, as Mao Zedong said, people are the only resource in China. In Russia is the opposite. People are the only problem for Russia. They have all their economy is based on rich natural resources, which all the local guys, being many of them ethnically distinct and having a federalist structure from the very beginning, were trying to get control. And you mentioned it. And the most important thing, and the third biggest thing, and you alluded to that, is that Russia was tremendously more militarized than China. And all this thing about the defense budget is basically the inability of the defense industry to transition to any other market-facing product that was useful in any way. So those three things are very important to incorporate in your description. But the most important thing, and you alluded to that, but I think the emphasis is not enough, that Gorbachev created political democracy. There is a party conference which happened in 87 or 88, which passed the law that created the Congress of the Soviet
People's deputies.
People's deputies, which for the first time created legal kind of competitive elections and created a body which was not directly party obedient, and in a system which is completely based on vertical power, this actually opened the door for corruption. So you have all these rich assets who are there, the oil, the gas, the aluminum, you name it, and you have a collapse of central control, and people were expecting, so all this law that you're mentioning, in a sense, they became irrelevant, and you alluded to that at the end, that there was a de facto privatization going all through the 80s already that made all these things kind of, not relevant. I think that's kind of the big difference. The Chinese controlling the Communist Party, they were able to change the rules and actually enforce the rules, and those rules produce results.
That's right, yeah.
And the final comment, very petty, on one of your slides, you're talking about Gorbachev, but you actually have a picture of Rishkov. So
I'll have to
go
check
back,
that. I don't think
here's
that's
the
right. I'll
picture,
check that.
Because you're losing credibility between the big experts.
Well, I'll pick up on a couple of those comments. One on the centrality of democracy to Gorbachev's reform efforts. I think that's right, and it's a huge difference with China. And it's important, I think, to realize that democracy was an economic strategy. So if you're running a Communist Party hierarchy that is dead set against economic reforms, you can't work through the party. So your only option is to find a way around the party. And Gorbachev thought that democracy was the best way to do that. If you hold free elections, you can bring new people into power, hope that these new officials are going to be more pro-reform than the old elite was. Whereas China faced an entirely different situation, because in China, the party hierarchy, the officials from Beijing on down, were largely supportive of economic reforms because they thought they'd be made better off as a result. So Gorbachev had to turn to democracy to get his economic strategy pushed through. It wasn't only a political effort, it was also an economic effort.
Do you want to comment on the question of Soviet regionalism versus Russian or Chinese centralism?
Sure. Well, a couple of things. I mean, first, it's easy to overemphasize Chinese centralism. And I think the Chinese, they're very worried about Tibet, they're worried about Xinjiang, and I think the extent to which they're worried about these provinces suggests that they're not as confident in their centralism as we might think they are. The second issue is that when you look at Chinese economic policymaking over the past 30 years, in fact, it's largely a debate between regions and the center. And so, for example, one of the challenges that China has in reducing its investment rate right now, which it's trying very hard to do, is that investment decisions are largely made at the local level, and local government officials, they can get directives from the center saying, please reduce investment, but they usually don't have to listen. And so right now there's a big back and forth push between local and central in China. It's been going on for a long time, where China too struggles to get local officials to follow its writ. So I don't see that as being substantially different than the Soviet case. I think what went wrong in the Soviet case is the economy just collapsed, and then the central government had no more tools with which to discipline local leaders or to incentivize them to follow their instructions. When you have no tax base, you are much less appealing as a central leader to a local government that's not listening to you. Whereas in China, the government has always been able to keep enough tax revenue coming to Beijing, and so it's been able to find ways to incentivize local leaders and punish them when they don't follow rules from the center. But I see the federalism as something that's just been managed better in China because they've had more resources with which to do it.
I think I'll take the option of asking the final question, and then we'll close. There is sort of implicit in a lot of what you're saying, the idea that things could have gone better for the Soviet Union, and maybe conversely, things could have gone worse for the Chinese economy. One of the ways out for the Soviet Union might have been not cutting spending, not raising taxes, not borrowing more, but getting growth. I mean, that is, you alluded to three options. The growth is sort of the fourth option you didn't get. China gets growth. The Soviet Union gets collapse. And growth, even of a moderate kind, might have done, I don't know if it would have saved the Soviet Union or Gorbachev, but it certainly wouldn't have hurt. Why was China able to get some growth fairly rapidly out of its reforms, and the Soviet Union, by your telling, didn't get any growth at all?
The problem is 100% in the time lag. So Deng Xiaoping's, Mao Zedong dies in 76, and Deng Xiaoping consolidates power by around 78. And so he's able to start his reforms very early, and there's not immediate demands to see results. So they start in the countryside, they slowly move to the city, and he has about a decade to prove that his reforms are working. Whereas Gorbachev, because he faces so much opposition, doesn't have the time. So he feels like he has to make a big bet and hope that it pays off. And so he makes a big bet by cutting these deals, and they're deficit finance deals in practice. And the result is that he's only got a couple of years, and he needs very rapid growth in those couple of years to get good results. But unfortunately, he doesn't get that growth in the short time period. And then you have this big fiscal inflation crisis that leads to a collapse. And so if you actually look at productivity statistics of privatized businesses, over time you do see pretty substantial growth. You see improvement, but it doesn't happen in the right time frame for Gorbachev's political constraints, which means that he has to rush and hope that growth is going to come rapidly enough, and it doesn't come rapidly enough. And that's the fundamental problem that he faces.
I think that's a good note to close on. For historians, it's always a question of time, and we have run out of our time today. So there are copies of Dr. Miller's book available outside for purchase. I didn't ask him, but I feel fairly sure he'd be willing to stick around for a few minutes and sign copies if anyone would like to purchase one. But in either case, I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Miller for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.